My name is Vivian Clark. I am 58 years old, and for the past 20 years, I've worked as a senior executive at a multinational company in Seattle. To most people, I'm just another quiet woman who keeps to herself. They notice the small apartment, the old car, the modest clothes, and assume I live an ordinary life. What they don't see are the contracts I sign, the departments I run, or the lives I've built through sheer determination. I've never needed to show what I have. I just needed to live peacefully. My son Ethan doesn't know everything about me. He knows I work in an office and that I'm comfortable, but he's never seen the numbers or the scale of what I do. I wanted him to grow up without depending on money. To understand that success means nothing if it costs your character. When he got married to Claire Morrison 3 years ago, I saw how much he wanted to fit into a world of luxury, noise, and people who talk too loudly about their wealth. One Tuesday evening, while I was finishing up a report, Ethan called. His voice sounded tight, polite, almost formal. "Mom, Claire's parents are visiting from New York. They'd love to meet you. We are having dinner at La Maison in downtown this Saturday." Something in his tone made me pause. It wasn't excitement. It was nervousness. I asked, "Do they know anything about me?" There was a short silence before he said, "I told them you work in an office and that you like simple things." Simple. That word lingered in my mind long after we hung up. My son, the boy I raised to see value beyond appearances, now feared I might not look impressive enough. That night, as rain drummed softly against my window, I made a decision. I would meet them exactly as they expected me to be, plain, unremarkable, and invisible. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth. I wanted to see how they treated someone they believed had nothing to offer. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted my son to remember who taught him what real worth means. Saturday arrived wrapped in grey clouds and drizzle, the kind of quiet rain that seems to wash everything clean. I woke early, brewed coffee, and stood before my closet. Rows of tailored suits hung beside plain sweaters and faded dresses. My hand reached for a simple navy one, soft from years of wear. It wasn't elegant, but it was honest. I tied my hair back, slipped on old flats, and looked in the mirror. The reflection staring back wasn't the executive who managed millions. She was just a woman, ordinary, unnoticed, and perfect for tonight. The taxi ride downtown was slow, the city shimmering through the rain. Couples hurried under umbrellas, people ducked into warm cafes, and the lights of Seattle reflected off the wet streets. When the driver asked if I was meeting someone special, I smiled faintly. "Something like that," I replied. La Maison was already buzzing when I arrived. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, laughter floated over clinking glasses, and the air smelled of rosemary and expensive wine. Ethan stood near the entrance, checking his watch. His face softened when he saw me, though his eyes carried a flicker of concern. "Mom, you look nice," he said, his voice tight with politeness. Claire greeted me with a brief hug, careful not to wrinkle her designer dress. "So glad you could make it, Mrs. Clark," she said. Her tone was kind, but distant. Then came her parents, Margaret and Richard Morrison. They were exactly as I imagined, elegant, confident, and used to being admired. Margaret's diamonds sparkled as she extended her hand, her smile smooth and practiced. "It's such a pleasure to meet you. Claire tells us you live quite simply." I nodded, matching her smile. "Simplicity suits me." As we sat down, the conversation flowed easily on their side. They spoke of vacations, art galleries, and renovations on their third home. When they turned to me, the questions were sharp and polite, like needles wrapped in silk. "Do you manage to cover your bills alone? It must be hard living by yourself," Margaret asked. I answered each question calmly, without a trace of defensiveness. Then Margaret leaned closer, her tone syrupy sweet. Ethan has such a generous heart. If you ever need help financially, dear, we'd be happy to assist. Maybe a small allowance each month. I looked at her, smiling gently. How thoughtful, I said, letting the words hang in the air. Inside, I could feel the first stirrings of something deeper, quiet, steady, and waiting. For a moment, no one spoke. The air between us felt heavy, almost fragile. Ethan lowered his eyes, shame flickering across his face. Claire shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tracing the edge of her napkin. Margaret's smile remained, but her tone softened, as if she was speaking to a child. We just want to make things easier for you, Vivian. Perhaps $700 a month, just enough to help with expenses. Ethan and Claire shouldn't have to worry, she said. I set my fork down quietly and looked at her. $700, I repeated, as if tasting the number. She nodded, clearly pleased that I hadn't taken offense. Richard added smoothly, we are fortunate, and we believe in helping those who have less. Those who have less. The words landed softly, but they cut deep. I looked at my son, the boy who once beamed with pride at my achievements, now sitting silently, letting others decide my worth. I smiled. That's very kind, I said. Then I leaned back slightly. Out of curiosity, how much did you contribute to their home? Margaret blinked, surprised by the question. Oh, $40,000 for the down payment and $15,000 for the honeymoon. Paris, of course. I nodded slowly. $55,000. That's about what I make in a single month. The table froze. Richard frowned. I continued evenly, that's about my monthly income. I'm a regional director at Titan Technologies. I manage operations across 5 states. The people I work with don't measure character in dollars. The color drained from Margaret's face. Claire's eyes widened. Ethan whispered, Mom. I looked at him gently. You didn't lie, son. You just forgot that simplicity isn't the same as lack. I reached into my bag and took out my corporate card, placing it on the table. Dinner's on me, I said softly. Consider it a courtesy from the woman you thought needed your charity. The waiter appeared, unsure as the entire table sat in stunned silence. For the first time all evening, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. The rain had softened into a fine mist outside, and I stepped back from the interaction with calm confidence. Ethan looked at me, eyes wide with a mix of relief and guilt. Mom, he started, but I placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Son, let them learn without insults. Sometimes truth is louder than words. Margaret and Richard exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. Richard cleared his throat, trying to mask the surprise that flickered across his face. Claire sat frozen, unsure how to respond, the polite mask she had worn all evening beginning to crack. You must understand, I continued evenly, I've never asked for assistance from anyone. I manage operations across 5 states at Titan Technologies. The people I work with don't measure character in dollars. They measure integrity, dedication, and results. You may live in a world where wealth equals worth, but outside that bubble, life is measured differently. The table fell silent again. I allowed the weight of my words to settle. Ethan's posture straightened, as if a tension he had carried all night was finally released. He glanced at me, and I could see pride flicker across his face. Claire's eyes glistened, unsure whether to be angry or awed. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't realize, she stammered. We just thought, Richard cut in, we wanted to help, that's all. I understand, I said calmly. But help should never be measured by assumption. True support is respect, not pity. A few moments passed, and the waiter lingered quietly, uncertain if he should serve or retreat. I smiled faintly at him, letting him know everything was under control. The table's tension slowly dissipated, replaced by an awkward, humbled quiet. After a few minutes, Ethan reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "Mom, thank you for showing them." I squeezed his fingers. "Son, sometimes people need to see rather than hear. Tonight, you witnessed that lesson too." Claire's voice finally broke, soft and uncertain. I never realized how much I followed what my parents valued. I want to learn from you, Mrs. Clark. I want to do better." I nodded. "Change starts with awareness, Claire. Understanding comes before action. Respect others for who they are, not for what they appear to have." The rest of the dinner passed with quieter conversation. The Morrison parents no longer spoke condescendingly. They were polite, careful, subdued, a stark contrast to the confident, superior tone they had carried before. When the meal ended, I left the restaurant before anyone could follow, stepping into the night's drizzle. The cool air brushed my face, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. I hadn't raised my voice, humiliated anyone, or sought revenge. Yet, truth had done its work, subtle, unyielding, undeniable. The taxi ride back to my apartment was quiet, the streets glistening from the rain. Ethan sat beside me, a mix of relief and guilt written on his face. "Mom. I didn't realize," he said softly. I forgot who you really are." "You forgot for a moment, son," I replied gently. "Remembering is what matters." When I stepped out and entered my apartment, the familiar warmth wrapped around me. The city lights reflected off the glass, casting soft shadows across my small but cozy home. It wasn't grandeur that filled this space, it was calm, order, and the satisfaction of being true to oneself. The next morning, the city was quiet, washed clean by the rain. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, illuminating my small kitchen table. I brewed coffee and sat down, replaying the events of the previous night. There was no anger, no bitterness, only a profound sense of peace. The kind that comes when truth has spoken for itself. My phone buzzed. It was Ethan. I hesitated, letting the moment linger, but something urged me to answer. "Mom," he began, voice unsteady. "I'm so sorry for what happened last night. After you left, they tried to justify themselves, saying they were just being kind, but I couldn't listen. I told them everything, what you've done, what you've achieved. They were shocked, and I told them they owed you respect, not pity." I stayed silent, letting him continue. Then his voice cracked slightly. "Claire cried. She said she never realized how much she sounded like her mother. She wants to come see you, to apologize." I took a slow breath. "Apologies are easy, Ethan. Change takes courage." "I know," he said softly. "But I think she means it. And I want to be better, too." There was a long pause. Then he whispered, "Mom, I was embarrassed last night. Not by you, but by myself. I forgot who raised me." My heart ached at his words, but I smiled. "You forgot for a moment. That's all. Remembering is what matters." 3 days later, a soft knock came at my door. When I opened it, Claire stood there holding a small bouquet of daisies. No makeup, no designer clothes, just a simple beige sweater and jeans. For the first time, she looked like herself, not a reflection of her parents' expectations. "Mrs. Clark," she said softly. "May I come in?" "Of course," I replied, stepping aside. She walked in slowly, her eyes taking in the small apartment, the worn armchair, the neatly stacked books, and the faint smell of fresh coffee. "It's cozy," she said, almost surprised. "Peaceful." I smiled. "That's what I like about it." She placed the flowers on the counter, hands trembling slightly. "I came to apologize," she said, voice unsteady, for how I treated you and for what I allowed my parents to say. I grew up thinking money defined respect. I didn't realize how wrong that was until last night. Calm, proud, unshaken, you showed me what true dignity looks like. I studied her carefully. It's not easy to unlearn what you were taught. But it's brave to start. Tears filled her eyes. I want to change. I don't want to be like them. I don't want Ethan to be ashamed of kindness or simplicity. I nodded. Then begin by listening more than you speak, and by valuing people for who they are, not what they own. The rest will follow. Claire took a deep breath and looked around the room again. I see now why Ethan loves coming here. It feels safe. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was healing. Then she said softly, I hope one day you'll forgive me. I smiled gently. Forgiveness doesn't need time, only understanding. You've already earned it. When she left, she hugged me, genuine, warm, real. I watched her walk down the hallway, lighter than when she arrived. As I closed the door, I whispered to myself, maybe tonight I wasn't the only one who found peace. Weeks passed, and life settled into a quiet rhythm again. Ethan and Claire began visiting every Sunday. Sometimes they brought groceries, sometimes just stories and laughter. There were no more awkward silences, no careful performances. It felt natural, like family should. Claire had changed more than I could have imagined. She no longer wore the mask of perfection. She talked openly about her work, her mistakes, her plans, and every time she laughed, it sounded freer, lighter. One afternoon, as we cooked together, she said, You know, Mrs. Clark, I used to think happiness was expensive. I smiled. And now? She stirred the soup thoughtfully. Now I think it's just quiet. I nodded. Peace is the one luxury most people can't afford because they don't know it's free. Ethan joined us, placing fresh bread on the table. You two sound like philosophers, he teased. Just women who've learned a few lessons, I replied, smiling. After lunch, we sat by the window, watching the light fade over the city. The air smelled faintly of rain. And for the first time, Claire reached for my hand. Thank you, she said simply, for not giving up on me. I squeezed her fingers gently. We all stumble when we confuse wealth with worth. The key is to recognize the fall and get up wiser. She nodded, smiling through glassy eyes. I'm learning. Later, as they prepared to leave, Ethan hugged me tightly. Mom, I used to think your silence meant you didn't care. Now I know it meant you were stronger than any of us. I smiled at him. Silence isn't weakness, son. It's power under control. When the door closed behind them, the apartment was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel empty. I looked around at the little space I'd built, filled not with things, but with calm. I realized that life doesn't reward the loudest voices. It rewards those who stay true when no one's watching. And that truth, I thought, was worth more than all the riches in the world. Months later, the rhythm of my days shifted again. I began mentoring younger women at work, single mothers, fresh graduates, women doubting their own strength. Every week, they'd gather in the small conference room I reserved after hours. We'd talk about leadership, balance, and the quiet power of integrity. One evening, a young woman named Sophie asked me, Mrs. Clark, how did you stay strong when people underestimated you? I smiled. By remembering that what others think of you says more about them than it does about you, and by never confusing wealth with worth. Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes bright. I could see a reflection of my younger self in her hopeful, determined gaze. That night, after everyone left, I stayed in the office for a while. The city glowed outside my window, soft silver light reflecting on the water. 1,000 stories unfolded in every direction. I thought about the night at La Maison, the Morrison parents, Ethan's apology, Claire's tears. None of it hurt anymore. It had all become something else, a lesson, a turning point, a quiet beginning. When I finally went home, I brewed tea and opened my journal, the same one I'd written in after that dinner. I flipped to a new page and wrote, "Real power isn't loud. It doesn't need to announce itself. It stands still when others perform. It listens when others brag. And it forgives when others don't know how." I closed the journal and looked around my apartment. Everything I owned fit into this small space, yet it felt abundant, not because of what was here, but because of what wasn't. Fear. Noise. Pretense. I walked to the window, the cool air brushing my face. Down on the street, people hurried home, carrying groceries, holding hands, living ordinary lives. I smiled. Wealth, I thought, isn't about what fills your house. It's about what fills your heart. And as the lights of Seattle shimmered against the night sky, I knew the truth that had carried me all along: money fades. Dignity doesn't. The next morning, I sat at my small kitchen table, sipping coffee. The city was calm, washed clean by rain. I watched children run through puddles, their laughter echoing faintly, and realized that life had a way of humbling everyone. Some through loss, others through truth. And maybe last night had been both for Ethan, my son who needed to see real value beyond appearances. Later that week, Ethan and Claire visited again. Claire looked more relaxed, her smile natural, no longer rehearsed. She placed flowers on the table and laughed freely, the mask of perfection gone. I watched them both and felt a swell of quiet pride. The lessons I had worked so hard to instill were finally taking root. At work, mentoring Sophie and the other young women gave me a new sense of purpose. Their questions, doubts, and courage reminded me of my younger self. I guided them, not with grand speeches, but with lived experience, demonstrating that strength is often quiet and steady, not loud and flashy. That evening, as I left the office, the city shimmered under a light drizzle. Neon lights reflected on the wet streets, strangers hurried beneath umbrellas, and the hum of life continued. I felt a deep, calm satisfaction. Nothing had been forced. Nothing had been rushed. I realized that true wealth isn't measured in money or appearances. It's measured in the respect earned quietly, the lives touched sincerely, and the dignity maintained when no one is watching. And in that understanding, I found my peace, unchanging, enduring, and mine alone. Weeks passed, and life continued its quiet rhythm. Sundays became a tradition. Ethan and Claire would visit, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. Sometimes they brought groceries, sometimes laughter and stories. The air in my apartment was no longer tense with expectation. It was warm, welcoming, and filled with authentic connection. Claire had transformed completely. She no longer tried to mirror her parents' rigid standards. She spoke openly about her life, her work, and her mistakes. Her laughter, once constrained by the weight of perfection, now rang freely. One afternoon, as we prepared a simple lunch together, she smiled at me and said, "Vivian, I used to think happiness was something expensive, something you had to earn or buy. But now, I see it's quiet. It's about being at peace with yourself and others." I nodded, stirring the soup gently. "That's the one luxury most people overlook," I said. "It's free for those who recognize it." Ethan, observing us, added softly, "I used to think Mom's silence meant she didn't care. Now I know it was strength, not absence. It taught me more than words ever could." I smiled at him. "Silence isn't weakness, son. It's power under control. And remembering your roots, your values, is the true measure of success." Claire reached out and squeezed my hand. "Thank you, Vivian, for not giving up on me. For showing me that respect and kindness matter more than appearances or money." I felt warmth spread through me. We all stumble when we confuse wealth with worth, I replied. The important thing is to learn, to rise wiser, and to extend that understanding to others. The Morrison parents had stopped visiting for a while, but the lessons of that night lingered in Ethan and Claire. Slowly, they adjusted their values, learning to appreciate people for who they were rather than what they had. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but subtle, persistent, and real, just like life itself. At work, mentoring Sophie and other young women continued to bring me joy. Their energy, questions, and determination reminded me of my own journey. I encouraged them to seek quiet strength, to value integrity above appearances, and to measure success by the impact they had on others' lives. One evening, standing at my apartment window, watching Seattle glimmer under a light drizzle, I reflected on everything. Life doesn't reward the loudest voices. It rewards those who remain true when no one is watching. The lessons, the challenges, and the quiet victories all shaped who I was. Ethan joined me briefly at the window. "Mom, thank you," he said simply. "For everything. For showing me the real meaning of strength and dignity." I smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You remembered, son. That's all that matters." As the city lights shimmered on the wet streets below, I knew one thing with certainty: money fades, appearances fade, but dignity, integrity, and quiet strength endure. And in that truth, I had found a peace that no one could ever take away. The world outside moved on, strangers hurried past under umbrellas, and life continued in its ordinary, beautiful rhythm. But inside, I felt a profound satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing you've lived, and loved, with authenticity, courage, and grace.